予定時刻となりましたので、早速始めさせていただきたく存じます。本日はお忙しい中、当事務所主催ウェビナー、ルクセンブルク国立大学教授から学ぶサプライチェーンレジリエンスとはにご参加くださいまして、誠にありがとうございます。進行を務めさせていただきます、ルクセンブルク貿易投資事務所の石黒と申します。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。はじめにタイムスケジュールをご説明させていただきます。冒頭、ルクセンブルクとロジスティクスセクター紹介を当事務所のセールスマーケティングマネージャーの中丸直也より日本語でお話しさせていただきます。続いて、サプライチェーンレジリエンスをルクセンブルク国立大学センターフォーロジスティクス&サプライチェーンマネジメントセンター長のベニー・マンティン教授にお話しいただきます。教授の講演は英語ですが、スライドは英語に日本語訳を併記しております。最後に16時30分より質疑応答セッションを行う予定です。タイムスケジュールの説明は以上です。
皆様改めまして、ルクセンブルク貿易投資事務所の中丸と申します。私からルクセンブルクとロジスティックセクターについて簡単にご紹介させていただきます。ルクセンブルクは、ベルギー、フランス、ドイツに囲まれたヨーロッパの中心に位置しており、面積は神奈川県ほどの大きさ、また人口は約62万人ほどでございます。ヨーロッパの主要都市からはフライトが乗り入れており、パリからは高速鉄道 TGV で約2時間でアクセス可能です。ルクセンブルクは EU の原加盟国でありますが、複数の EU 機関、欧州投資銀行や欧州裁判所などがございます。また、前欧州委員長のユンカー氏も元ルクセンブルク首相でした。ルクセンブルクは人口の約半分が外国人で、公用語はドイツ語、フランス語、ルクセンブルク語の3カ国語、そしてビジネスの場では英語でも堪能です。ヨーロッパの中では最も国際的でオープンなビジネス環境を有する国の一つだと言えると思います。ルクセンブルクに拠点子会社を持つ日本企業のリストになります。ルクセンブルクの GDP の 25% 近くを金融とそのサービス関連の企業が占めております。そのため、ルクセンブルクには日本の大手信託銀行様、また保険会社様等が多く進出しています。また、製造業ロジスティックスに関して言えば、ファナック様が欧州本社と欧州のディストリビューションセンターを、またセントラルガラス様が自動車用のガラスの製造工場を、そしてまたロジスティックス分野では日立物流様が子会社のマーズロジスティックス社を通じて、ルクセンブルクやトルコを拠点に欧州域内でインターモーダル輸送の輸送サービスを提供しております。ルクセンブルクではその戦略的な立地を生かし、ロジスティックスセクターは常に成長を続けてまいりました。ルクセンブルクの国の経済発展政策の中でも、ロジスティックスは優先セクターの一つとして位置づけられています。こちらは先ほど申し上げたファナックヨーロッパ社のルクセンブルクのディストリビューションセンターの写真です。また、ルクセンブルクにはヨーロッパ最大の貨物専用航空会社カーゴルクスの本拠地がございます。そのため、ルクセンブルク空港もヨーロッパで6番目に大きい貨物空港の規模を誇っており、中でも厳密な温度管理を必要とする医薬品や生鮮品、また動物や自動車などの特殊貨物の扱いに非常に長けています。コロナ禍の中でもルクセンブルクの空港はほぼ 100% フル稼働しておりまして、実際にヨーロッパ以外のアジアなどからの緊急支援物資や医療品等をルクセンブルク空港からを通じてヨーロッパ各国に配送いたしました。また、ルクセンブルクはインフラだけでなく人材教育にも力を入れています。ルクセンブルク国立大学の中に2015年、ルクセンブルクセンターフォーロジスティックス&サプライチェーンマネジメント、通称 LCL を設立いたしました。こちらは 次世代のそのデジタル時代に対応した、SCM、ロジスティックスの人材を教育するために設立されました。こちらの LCL では、キューネ&ナーゲル社やアマゾン社といったグローバル企業との共同研究、また、エグゼクティブ向けのワークショップやセミナー等産学連携にも積極的に取り組んでいます。で、今日はその LCL からベニー・マンティン教授にゲストとして登壇いただきます。マンティン教授はヨーロッパ航空会議の理事を務められ、また複数の学術機関で講演されるなど、非常に国際的なバックグラウンドをお持ちです。今日のウェビナーのトピックスは主に2つございます。まず1つ目はルクセンブルクの取り組みの共有です。パンデミック、コロナウイルスの感染の拡大はルクセンブルクでもサプライチェーンやそしてロジスティックスセクターに大きな混乱をもたらしました。ルクセンブルクではまだ外出制限が敷かれる4月中旬にベニー・マンティン教授がリーダーとなり、ルクセンブルクとロジスティックスセクターにもたらされた影響を調査・分析し、今後必要な対応策を国に提言するためのタスクフォース WP13 が立ち上がりました。ベニー・マンティン教授は WP13 のリーダーです。で、今日のウェビナーではその WP13 で得られたその調査結果を共有いただくとともに、その中で実際に国に提言され、実際にもうすでに始まっているプロジェクト、国のコントロールタワープロジェクトについても共有いただきます。また2つ目は、昨今そのパンデミックを通じて日本の製造業様でもグローバルサプライチェーンの見直しの必要性ということをメディア等でもよく拝見しますが、そもそも企業様がサプライチェーンのレジリエンスを高めていくためにどのような考え方でアプローチすべきか、その基礎となる考え方についてマンティン教授に講義いただきます。私からのプレゼンテーションは以上となります。それでは、一旦、画面共有を止めさせていただきます。Then, Professor Martin, I finished my presentation now. So, would you start sharing your screen and start presentation?
Yes. Thank you very much. I just need a second to transition here. Share. It's not on presentation mode. Sorry. Can you see my presentation screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Oh, sorry. Thank you very much, Naoya, for setting up this webinar. Thank you everyone for joining us today for a brief overview of supply chain resilience and different aspects relating to Luxembourg. So as mentioned, my name is Benny Mantin and I'm the director of the Luxembourg Center for Logistics and Supply Chain Management. In the next slides, I will talk a little bit about the task force that was established to assess and target supply chain issues and logistics in the context of the pandemic. And then I will transition into the concept of supply chain resilience. So similar to many other places, once the pandemic reached Luxembourg and Europe, we have seen unprecedented consequences that were common in numerous places for a number of days. So for example, on the left-hand side, you see major lines of trucks waiting to cross borders. And one of the things that happens earlier in the situation is that many countries in Europe decided to close their borders to stop the flow of people from one country to another to mitigate the spread of the pandemic, of the virus. But while you are stopping flow of people, it was also stopping the flow of goods and materials. And one of the immediate consequences was that we went to supermarkets and were faced with empty shelves. Those scenes were not limited to Europe. I'm sure you have seen them elsewhere. I just wanted to show quick impact of what has been observed in Europe. And I'm sure that in Japan, you've seen similar consequences. So we need to realize that flows of goods and services are at the core of how economic prosperity is generated. What we see nowadays as a result of major changes and progression in the past few decades, that we see increased degree of globalization. Supply chains surround the world. We see a high degree of specializations along the supply chain. So supply chains become much longer, with a lot of the nodes really specializing on very small aspect of the entire supply chain. And those supply chains now become increasingly intertwined. So they are crossing each other in multiple ways. Manufacturers all over the place start embracing just-in-time practices and lean manufacturing. Those are concepts that are very commonly used in Japan as well. We also realize that manufacturers have very limited visibility into their supply chains, in the sense that they may know their suppliers, the first tier of their suppliers, but rarely do they know who are their suppliers, basically tier 2, and almost no visibility at all deeper into their supply chains. So all of these are getting together to unleash unprecedented impact on supply chains once the COVID erupted. We noticed national lockdowns, borders were closed, export restrictions, physical distancing. So all those effects had major impacts everywhere. And it took us a while to understand how to respond and how to ease and relax those restrictions to ensure that supply chains can keep operating. What is really unique about this pandemic and this major disruption, that it is not limited to the impact on the supply side. So as we said, basically supply side has been quite restricted, flows are damaged. But what is really unique here is that we also have the disruption on the other side, the demand side. And by the time that the supply side started going to normal, whatever the new normal is, the effect reached the demand side, and we are facing a double shock that is really sending shock waves through the systems. So early during the pandemic, we decided to establish the Research Luxembourg Task Force. This is a collaboration between the different research institutions based in Luxembourg, the university, LIST, the Luxembourg Institute of Health, LISER, and with support from the Luxembourg Institute for the Research Fund, and also from additional organizations that were involved in the process. So we set up a research task force with multiple work packages. One of those work packages was number 13, our work packages that focused on supply chain and logistics. In our context, we also got support from INSERT, which is a government institution for cybersecurity, the Ministry of Economy, and Luxembourg Innovation, so Lux Innovations. And our scope was to address some very fundamental and simple questions. What effects do we observe in Luxembourg? What lessons can we learn? And what can we do next? So to address those two questions, we decided to operate along two pillars. So the first pillar was to understand the local impacts. So to understand the local impacts, we carried out a survey, logistics network disruptions, and we sent it to all major stakeholders in this domain. So we sent out to 63 companies that have operations in Luxembourg. We had a phenomenal response rate of 55%. And this is already an indication that companies wanted to voice their concerns, wanted to have contact with the different stakeholders to make sure that their concerns are being addressed. Some of the insights are quite obvious, so I will go through them quite quickly. We notice a major shift in the different sectors. So automotive, steel, fashion, and retail all went down early during the pandemic. On the other hand, e-commerce, healthcare, pharmaceuticals went up quite dramatically. So I think this is not too surprising. When we're looking on the impacts on their operation, this is the graph we have on the right-hand side. There are many observations, but I will take you only through the two main ones. So the first bar demonstrates that the number of shipments have dropped down dramatically almost across the board. So many of the respondents, this is the black part here. You can see about 20 respondents out of the 30 something that have responded say that we notice reduction in the number of shipments. When they do have shipments, what you can see on this bar, the third from the right, it is almost never full. So the vehicle fill rate has gone down as well. So you can see that even when they do have shipments, what they have in the shipment is of much lesser volume. One of the biggest questions that we're facing was uncertainty. Clearly, in the current environment, they're not really sure what to expect. They don't know what will happen tomorrow. Things were very hectic early during the pandemic. And also in terms of business resumption plan, we noticed that only a smaller number of companies had some business resumption plan, and it was more likely the larger ones to have such a plan in place. We also solicited other open-ended questions. They have expressed issues regarding staffing. So staffing is a major concern because many of your employees now have to work at home. They have to keep distance. We had temporary employment. So all those issues regarding staffing were a bigger concern for the company. So lots of things were moving in different directions at the same time. Liquidity was a major concern as well. How do you manage your operations when you're not sure about the futures and when moving, you want to preserve your liquidity, and how do you make sure that you still manage your operation in a financially sustainable way? They also expressed wishes for improved coordination and consolidation. So at the early stage, as I mentioned, the different countries started closing the borders. And what they were hoping for is that all European countries will get together and have a unified procedure. So now things are much better. It took a while to resurrect from this point, but ideally we should have coordinated the flow in a much better shape early on. As I mentioned, business resumption plan was a concern that not many companies have it in place. And related to that is the concept of supply chain risk analysis. We also wanted to know whether companies had any supply chain risk analysis in place carried out prior to the pandemic, and if it played out in such a way that they knew how to respond. Again, it seemed that primarily major companies, larger companies have carried out some supply chain risk analysis. But again, only a small fraction of the total companies had any training in this context. So this is a concept we want to leverage, because if supply chain risk analysis is something that companies are less familiar with, and maybe we need to spend more time educating stakeholders. So this will lead us soon to the supply chain resilience, but one of the takeaways from the logistics surveys is to develop a vision. So in order to improve coordination, improve visibility, we propose to establish a national control tower. We have written the proposal. We have received some grant from the funding agency. So FNR is a Fonds National de Research. We got the funding from this agency to develop the preliminary dashboard. And this will connect different stakeholders on a single screen, such that the different users, government, different stakeholders will have more visibility to see what is going on in the system. So what could be the outcome is that we have a multi-party dashboard that's looking into the different suppliers, the customer, the stores, how the transport is managed, and so forth. clearly it is based on the willingness of the different stakeholders to participate and to share information and data. We have established an advisory board, and we meet on a regular basis to outline the needs that the different stakeholders would like to see. And hopefully at the end of the project, which is a half-a-year project, we'll have some basic demo, then we can decide whether we want to proceed with the development or maybe transfer it to some other stakeholders who will take over. I think this is very promising, and this is something that is quite unique. Many companies have dashboards at their end, but it's limited to their own operation. And I think we need to move to the next phase where we integrate information from multiple sources to give a unified vision. Resilience. So we know that resilience is a major buzzword, this word. And the question is, how do you embrace resilience? First, we need to understand that there is a gap in knowledge there, and maybe are familiar with the concept, but there is more than just the concept. So first thing we suggest, educate yourself. There are multiple resources out there. The concept of resilience has been out for a while. There are a number of books. You can relate to those books by Yossi Sheffi, a professor from the MIT, and he's part of our MIT scale net. We are part of the related MIT scale network. So you can use the different resources. Nevertheless, one of the first activities, and you need to start mapping your supply chains. If you haven't done so, it is highly recommended that you start mapping your suppliers. Where do you think they are supplying from, and so forth. Try to go as deep as possible into your supply chain. And I will go back to the concept of mapping supply chain again towards the end of the presentation. Then also you need to identify and quantify the different risks that you may be facing. Take this illustration. You have two dimensions. One is the probability of disruption, and the other one is the consequence. So there are many different disruptions that could occur out there. Hundreds, maybe even thousands. You don't have to map all of them, but you have to go through somewhat exhaustive process to envision what could really have an impact on my business. So for example, if my truck has a flat tire, maybe the probability is not too low and the consequence is also quite minor. It gets, the delivery will be delayed by 2 hours. So that's fine, we can survive that. There might be a strike. So maybe the employees will start striking and I won't be able to deliver the goods and operate for a while. There is some probability here. The consequence is more major, but again, this is within the manageable, that is not such a major concern to some degree. There are some, like Brexit. Now we know for sure Brexit is happening. So it's like high probability. What are the consequences? Probably depends on your business. Some will have no consequence at all. Some will have major consequences. So you need to identify what would be the impact. And for those, you definitely have to have a plan in place. What is really unique here are those events that have very low probability and have significant impact on your business. So those are kind of the black swan events, and the pandemic is one of them. So for those, you really need, most of the companies just ignore that. What's the likelihood it will happen in my time? Very low, but when it happens, then it's really hard to predict what would happen. So we have the two, we have those two, and we need to start preparing responses for the different consequences. Now, there is another dimension that we need to take into account, the degree of detectability. How much time do I have before I see the consequence? So there is the point where the event happens, and it may take some time until I actually feel the consequences. So you can think of these dimensions of going from short to very long. There are some events that you will feel only after they have happened. Okay, so if there is theft or espionage, it happened at some point in the past, and you won't feel it until you are looking for those particular items or until the thief is asking for money. So you will see and notice only after the event has occurred. There are immediate impacts. So in your context, it's more like a tsunami. You know it's coming. You have few minutes, very short amount of time to respond. Whether you see the weather system approaching, so we have a couple of days to make some final adjustments. And we can also think about the very long range aging and global warming. So those are effects that we know they are coming. We have some time to prepare, and we can adjust more clearly to make sure that we have a plan in place. Now, what is really important here is that we do have some time to respond, but the better detection I have, the more time I have to actually to mitigate the potential consequences. So this goes again to the concept of dashboards and increasing the amount and level of sensing. Goes back to the same point of having a dashboard, having sensors in multiple places and so forth. Just an example, airlines heavily rely on precise weather forecast. So many airlines today have their sensors. So previously they relied on external forecasts, but now increasingly they have sensors on the plane, because those planes are in the sky, which can give you much better sensing of the skies. Then you can generate even more precise forecasts to understand what would be the impact on your operations. To understand supply chains on a single slide, we decided to go and look into the different dimensions that have impacts on resilience. So here we're illustrating two quite distinct supply chains, just as an illustration. One is of an automotive on the left-hand side, and one of a food item like bread on the right-hand side. When you're looking at automotive supply chains, there are many parts here, something in the magnitude of 30,000 parts. You're working with multiple suppliers, and maybe for the same component, you may or you may not have multiple suppliers as well. So one would be the contract suppliers, and maybe others would be suppliers that you can quickly enable. And those will come from different places. And as we know, those supply chains are very long, very complex, and you have very limited visibility to how far they go and how many times they go around the globe. On the other hand, we have a highly simplified supply chain, bread. For bread, you don't need so many components, 2 to 5 ingredients, depend on the type of bread you're making and how you make it. The ingredients are mostly locally sourced, and many times you may even know, yeah, I know this farmer up in the north, he's the one growing the grains. So you may even be able to understand the entire supply chain in a quite simplified way. So if we're looking at those domains, we have the degree of globalization. How global is your supply chain? Transparency. Can I see my supplier, and so forth? How deep can I go? So those are the two concepts I've explained already. The length of the supply chains. How many tiers do I have? Again, in automotive, you may easily have 10 to 20 different tiers until you go all the way to the resources. In food, 2 or 3 would be quite common. The degree of narrowness. So basically it relates to how many different alternative suppliers do you have for different components. So you need to make sure that you have alternative suppliers in case something goes wrong. Slack versus leanness. How lean is your supply chain? Alternatively, how much inventory do you have in your supply chains to ensure continuity when things goes wrong? And the degree of complexity. So as we said here, we have here on the left-hand side, 30,000, on the right-hand side, 2 to 5. Clearly, I'm comparing two different products. But even with the same product category, you can design your product with more parts or less parts. Why is this important? because the more parts you have in your product, the more risk you are embedding. So more things can go wrong. And as you can see, the red line here is quite increasing in the number of products. Clearly, there are ways and methods to reduce the amount of risk you are facing by embedding inventory, activating premium freight to make sure things flow faster and so forth. But there is only a limited amount of things that you can do to mitigate the risk. So therefore, when you're thinking about your product design, it's very important to think about how many elements to actually embed in the product, because I really want to minimize the degree of risk I'm exposing myself to. So going back to those different dimensions we have clarified, we want to think, yes, so I understand all those items, but how do they affect my resilience? So along each of those dimensions, you can activate some aspects relating to resilience. I'm kind of putting a high-level recommendations. It's not always trivial to translate them to actions immediately, but some careful thinking will reveal potential actions. So in terms of globalizations, reshoring can definitely help you with some of the risk associated with globalization. It will not resolve everything again, but you need to carefully decide what is that you want to reshore and what you want to keep far away. Transparency. Clearly, you want to gain visibility into upstream activities. You need to develop contracts and relationship with your suppliers so they will trust you, and then you will gain more visibility into upstream activities. Length of the supply chains, again, try to shorten, because the longer is your supply chain, the more nodes that can be exposed to risk are embedded in your supply chain. So if you can aggregate some activities and shorten things, then you are reducing the degree of risk. Narrowness. So you may want to find alternative and additional suppliers, maybe activate them as dual sourcing mode, or make sure that they are ready to operate once you need them. Slick and versus lean. Clearly, you need to balance the lean and the safety buffer, and we're going to get into that in a moment in the last slide. And complexity, as we mentioned, you want to simplify your products. There are other dimensions that we have not discussed, but are quite obvious. One is automation and digitization, or digitalization, depending on what aspect you're looking at. You want to embrace technology. So some technologies can really impact you in such a way that you can reduce the amount of risk you're facing in different scenarios. And coordinations, basically, it goes back to the concept of the dashboard to some degree. You want to communicate actions to reach stability. So the concluding part here is mapping your supply chains. As I mentioned, you want to start mapping the supply chain, go deeper in your network to understand what's happening. But even if you're just working with your immediate suppliers, there is a lot to be done. You want to essentially stress test each of those nodes in your supply chain. And what does it mean, stress test? So each of them can go through some major disruption, which will take the node down or your supplier down for some period of time. You want to know whether the supplier or whether you have enough inventory in the system to cover the disruption until the node comes back to operations. So we need to define two key measures here: time to recovery and time to survive. So time to recovery is like how long will it take the facility to come back to operation, and time to survive is how much inventory do I have to cover my operations. So inventory in terms of days. So here is an example that was carried out by Simchi Levy in his activities with Ford. So it's an automotive company. So they went through all the suppliers and said, like, how much inventory do you have in your system to cover operations? And here is a histogram looking into, some have only 1 day of inventory, 2 days of inventory, 3 days, and so forth, and then 1 week, 2 weeks, 10 weeks, and all the way to 50 or more. So what are the messages here? We have a large number of companies, suppliers, that carry only a single day of inventory. If any of these suppliers will go down, I will stop my operations within a day. So I won't be able to proceed. This means that we don't have enough inventory here. If I'm going to the other extreme, on the right-hand side, we have many suppliers that have a huge amount of inventory. In fact, they can go for the whole year going down before anything will be felt in my operations. Clearly, there is too much inventory here. So now I need to find the balance. What is the right balance? This is something that companies need to clarify for themselves. But it shows you that on the left-hand side, we are bearing a lot of risk if something goes wrong. On the right-hand side, we are carrying a lot of inventory that is absolutely not needed. So we need to remove inventory from the right-hand side. We need to increase the amount of inventory on the left-hand side. This will bring us close to the stress test in a more ideal way. Okay, to simply conclude, so supply chains are inherently complex. There are lots of levers out there that you can implement. So you need to understand your scope of business, and I'm sure you do that fairly well, but looking into the different aspects, find what levers that you need to change in order to make your supply chain more resilient. There are additional concepts in resilience. Clearly, this was a very brief presentation, but it's important that you start embracing resilience, educate yourself, start mapping your supply chains, identify the risk, and plan your actions accordingly. Thank you very much, and I will be glad to take questions, and I believe Naoya will manage this part of the webinar. Thank you.
Professor Mantin, thank you very much for your presentation. And I would like to move to the Q&A session from now. それでは皆様、ちょっと時間が、スケジュールが押しておりますが、ちょっと、もう少し時間の許す限り Q&A セッションに移らせていただきたいと思います。Q&A ある方はちょっと挙手いただくか Q&A のコラムにタイプいただければと思いますが、ちょっとまず先にですね、私の方で、一つ質問させていただきたいと思います。で、先ほどマーティン教授のプレゼンテーションの中であった国のコントロールタワーについて、今そのステークホルダーとその話し合いの最中だということだったんですけれども、具体的なそのユースケース、また AI やデジタルツインといった最新デジタルテクノロジーを活用されるということを表明されておりましたが、そういったことに関してちょっと具体的な、もう少し教授がイメージされている具体的なことをお聞きしたいと思います。So, Professor Mantin, while we were waiting for the questions from the audiences, I have one question about the control tower.
Yes, please.
And although I understood you are under discussion with various stakeholders, do you have some image that the actual use case of the national control tower, and do you have specific category or product segment that which can be used for the control tower? And I have one more question that digital technology such as AI or digital twin, how those technologies could be used to the control tower tool?
Thank you, Naoya. These are excellent questions. So we are still at an early stage of the control tower development, and we are working. So basically we have the three institutions, the university, LIST, and INSERT working together on the development. We have partnered with IBM, who is offering the platform for the dashboard, and we have established the advisory board for the dashboard as well. So we have delegates from industry, we have the cluster for logistics, we have the Ministry of Economy. So diverse stakeholders are involved in the dashboard. And clearly one of the things that we want to do is demonstrating case studies. So one of the case studies that we are deliberating is working with the healthcare industry. So we are now in discussion with one of the key hospitals in Luxembourg, and we want to bring them on board to develop a full case study to demonstrate how we can use the dashboard to gain visibility into this particular domain. It is also important to link the dashboard to a larger project. So LIST also has more fundamental projects funded by the FNR to have a digital twin for Luxembourg. So the digital twin is, I'm not too familiar with that. It's something that LIST could answer better than I can. But generally speaking, this digital twin kind of replicates the country of Luxembourg along different dimensions. I think the economy, different industries, population, but I'm sure that they have more in terms of the different aspects. And so all those different layers will create and provide ample visibility into different scopes of activities and decision in Luxembourg, and adding the logistics and supply chain layer on top of everything else would really instrumental in providing this degree of visibility. So I'm sure that they will be able to run such what-if scenarios, stress test the network. So I think that you want to study, for example, so this is a relatively small country. This is a small country. What happens if for example, we have a flood somewhere? Are we still resilient? Do we have alternatives? What if one road is impacted by some disruptions, or do we have enough capacity to ensure flows of goods elsewhere through the system? So those are things that you can estimate and evaluate using such systems.
Okay, thank you very much. And we just received the question from the one audience, but let me translate first your first answer. ではちょっと私の方で日本語にちょっと要約して教授の回答を翻訳させていただきますと、まずこのコントロールタワーのプロジェクトに関してはルクセンブルク大学とまたルクセンブルクの国立科学技術研究所が中心となってロジスティックス産業、またそのクラスター、ロジスティッククラスターですね、また経済省等を巻き込んで、進めているプロジェクトということでございます。で、ダッシュボードのツールは IBM に協力をいただいて、IBM のダッシュボードツールをベースにして、サプライチェーンのそのモニタリング、また、シミュレーション予測を可能にするツールを作ろうとしています。で、特にそのユースケースとして、まず考えられるのは、その医療業界、ヘルスケア業界で、まず、ルクセンブルクの中の大きな病院とも、ディスカッションをすでに始めているところだということです。また、ルクセンブルク科学技術研究所では、よりその大きなプロジェクトとして、そのルクセンブルクのデジタルツインプロジェクトといったものも、取り組みを進められているようで、このロジスティックスにサプライチェーンに関しては、そのルクセンブルク科学技術研究所が進めるデジタルツインのプロジェクトの一つの、レイヤーとしてそのロジスティックスの情報が、国の、デジタルツインというのは、デジタルの世界で構成するデジタルレプリカでございますけれども、そういった、そのツールを開発を目指していて、このロジスティックサプライチェーンもそのレイヤーに乗せるということが目的にしていますということです。で、そういった形でこのコントロールタワーのビジビリティを高めていき、各種いろんな在庫レベルであったりのシミュレーションに使えればということでした。Professor, we are receiving one inquiry that who will cover the cost of the national control tower, by taxes or by consumer directly?
That's a very good question. And thank you, Yasuo, for this question. And we have been also deliberating about this question as well. For the first phase of the project, it's basically funded by the FNR, so the Fonds National de Research. IBM gives us the platform for free, but I totally agree. There is a huge question mark hovering about the project. What will happen after the first phase? If the first phase is successful, I strongly believe that FNR will keep funding the development for extended period of time. Once it comes into fruition in the sense that you can start the operations, we will need to find a solution who can take over, because you need to operate, you need to maintain it. There are many aspects here, and those still remain to be addressed.
Okay, thank you.
What we were discussing is that with different stakeholders, look, there are different options here. One, I'm just taking the two extreme. One is let the researchers work on it for a while. This will be a low-cost solution. If it works, we can continue. If not, you have always the external options going to a third-party provider, and they have some kind of off-the-shelf solution that you can customize that tend to be more expensive. We are kind of torn between the two solutions. We say, like, let's see what we can do, how far we can push on the research frontier, and then see in terms of financial support, what would be the consequences. So yeah, it's a good question, and it still remains to be answered.
Thank you very much. ちょっと翻訳させていただきますと、実際その今のこれから半年間のプロジェクトのフェーズに関してはルクセンブルクの国立研究基金がその開発研究資金を提供することが決まっております。でまた IBM 社がそのダッシュボードツールを無料で提供していただくことにもなっています。ただその半年経った後にですね、それのそのコントロールタワーの効果みたいなのが実証されれば、国立研究基金が引き続き資金提供していただくという可能性もありますし、実際にそのコントロールタワーをオペレーションをしてまた維持していく誰かプレイヤーが必要になっていくわけで、そういったプレイヤーは今後探していくということになり、まだその例に関しては詳しくは決まっていません。またその今後半年後の開発結果次第では、民間企業等に再度委託するなどのそのサードパーティーのツールを使うといった可能性もあって、それはおそらくすごくコスト的には高くなってしまうということで、まだそのあたりはちょっと何とも言えない状況ですので、非常に今お答えすることは難しい状況ですということです。ただ、教授たちのプロジェクトチームではできる限り国立研究基金の資金が得られるような形で研究成果というものを出していきたいということをおっしゃっています。ちょっとですね、もうすいません、時間がかなり押してしまいましたので、ちょっと今日は一旦ここで司会にお戻しさせていただきたいと思います。Professor Martin, we are just behind the schedule, so for Q&A session, we shall end the Q&A session and we will put our screen back to the host.
Yeah, sorry for the longer presentation, but again, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you everyone for the excellent questions.
Thank you very much.
終了のお時間となりましたので、これをもちまして本日のウェビナーは終了させていただきたく思います。最後までお付き合いいただき、誠にありがとうございました。